The day my parents kicked me out of the house was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Outside, the late autumn wind swept through the tall trees lining our street in Chicago's Gold Coast district, scattering dry leaves across the pavement. Inside our house, our enormous, perfectly designed, painfully silent house, the air felt even colder. I stood in the center of the living room with my suitcase beside my feet. For 24 years, this place had been the stage of my life. Every corner held memories. Birthday parties arranged for appearances, elegant dinners with strangers my parents called partners, and long quiet evenings where I sat alone in my room while my parents worked late into the night. But at that moment, the house felt unfamiliar, like I was already a stranger in it. My mother stood near the marble fireplace, her posture straight, her arms folded neatly across her chest. Her expression was calm, too calm. I remember thinking she looked like someone delivering a business decision rather than ending a relationship with her daughter. "You're not our responsibility anymore, Olivia," she said. Her voice was sharp, controlled, and strangely rehearsed. The words hung in the air like something heavy and permanent. I looked at my father, hoping, desperately hoping, that he would say something different. That he would tell her she was being dramatic, or cruel, or wrong. But my father didn't even look up. He sat on the leather sofa with his phone in his hand, scrolling through emails as if the conversation unfolding in front of him was no more important than a meeting reminder. "Your mother already explained everything," he said flatly, still staring at the screen, as if disowning his daughter was just another item on his schedule. I felt something inside my chest tighten. "Dad, are you serious?" I asked quietly. He sighed like I had just asked a stupid question. "You embarrassed this family," he said. Finally, he looked up at me, but not with anger, with disappointment, which somehow hurt even more. The reason was simple, cruel, clear, and humiliating. 2 weeks earlier, my father had arranged a dinner with one of his most important business partners, a billionaire real estate developer named Richard Halstead. The dinner had been luxurious, formal, and filled with the kind of polite conversation that hides uncomfortable truths beneath expensive wine. But halfway through the evening, the real reason for the dinner revealed itself. My father had promised me to Richard Halstead's son. Not asked. Promised. The son, Nathan Halstead, was charming, polished, and perfectly dressed. But every time he spoke to me, I felt something deeply unsettling behind his smile. Like I wasn't a person to him. Just a transaction. A merger between families. Later that night, when my father proudly announced the future engagement, everyone at the table had applauded. Everyone except me. Because I stood up and said the one thing my parents had never expected to hear. No. The silence that followed was unbearable. I refused the marriage. In front of everyone. In front of investors, partners, and friends. In my parents' world, that kind of defiance wasn't just embarrassing. It was betrayal. "You threw away an opportunity most people would kill for," my mother said now, her voice steady but cold. "I threw away a life I never chose," I replied. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Ungrateful. That was the word she had used over and over during the past 2 days. Ungrateful for the education they paid for. Ungrateful for the life they gave me. Ungrateful for the future they planned. But what they really meant was something much darker. I had refused to be controlled. "You've always been emotional," my father said. "Impulsive." "This wasn't impulsive," I whispered. "It was survival." He shook his head slowly. "No, Olivia," he said. "It was selfish." My mother stepped forward slightly. "You've ruined the future we carefully built for you," she said. The way she said it made something painfully clear. This was never about my happiness. Only their plans. Only their reputation. Only their business. And in that moment, I understood something I had never fully admitted before. In this house, I had never been a daughter. I had been an asset. An investment waiting to be placed in the right partnership. And the moment I refused the deal, I became worthless. I bent down slowly and lifted my suitcase. It was surprisingly light. Just a few clothes, a notebook, and the small things that still felt like mine. I looked around the room one last time. Neither of my parents stopped me. Neither of them moved. Neither of them even tried to pretend they cared. What happens to me now? I asked quietly. My father shrugged. You're an adult, he said. Figure it out. So I walked toward the front door. Each step felt heavier than the last. But when I finally stepped outside, the cold air hit my face, and for the first time in my life, I realized something strange. The world outside that door felt terrifying, but also free. That night, I ended up sitting alone on a worn wooden bench in a small park in downtown Chicago. The city lights glowed in the distance while traffic hummed along the nearby streets. People passed by, laughing, talking, living lives that had nothing to do with mine. My suitcase sat beside me. My phone battery was almost dead. And for the first time in my life, I had nowhere to go. I leaned forward, pressing my hands against my face, trying to hold back the tears threatening to escape. Because losing the house wasn't what hurt the most. What hurt the most was realizing something that had probably been true for years. I had never really had a home. As the cold night deepened and the wind whispered through the empty park, a memory surfaced quietly in my mind. A warm voice. A gentle smile. The only person in my family who had ever looked at me with kindness instead of expectations. My grandfather. And suddenly I remembered something strange. Something he had given me years ago. A small black card he had pressed into my hand with a mysterious smile. At the time, I thought it was just one of his odd little gifts. But now, sitting alone in the dark with nowhere left to turn, that card was the only thing in the world that might still belong to me. My grandfather, Arthur Whitmore, had always been treated like a forgotten relic in our family. Whenever his name came up during family gatherings, my parents spoke about him with a strange mixture of embarrassment and impatience. To them, he was nothing more than a stubborn old man who refused to adapt to modern business. My father used to say that Grandpa Arthur had wasted his life living quietly in the countryside instead of expanding the family's influence. But the truth was much simpler. My grandfather didn't care about power. While my parents chased wealth, status, and social prestige, he spent his days in a quiet countryside house in Vermont, surrounded by shelves of old books and dusty photographs. It was a place my parents rarely visited. But to me, it felt like the only home I had ever known. I first visited him when I was 10 years old. I still remember stepping out of the car and smelling pine trees and fresh earth in the cool Vermont air. The house stood on a small hill overlooking a wide valley, simple and old but warm in a way our Chicago mansion never was. Grandpa opened the door himself. He wore a simple wool sweater and round glasses that always slid slightly down his nose. When he saw me, his face lit up with a smile so genuine it almost startled me. "Olivia," he said, kneeling down to hug me. "You've grown." My parents stayed only a few hours that day before leaving for a meeting in Boston. They told me I could stay the weekend. I secretly wished they would forget to come back. Grandpa never treated me like an obligation. When we talked, he didn't interrupt or correct me or lecture me about my future. He listened. Really listened. Sometimes we sat together on the wooden porch overlooking the valley while he told stories about places he had traveled in his younger years. Other times we walked through the forest trails behind the house while he asked me questions about school, friends, and the things I dreamed about. Not once did he ask what career I planned to pursue. Not once did he tell me what kind of person I needed to become. To him, I was already enough. As I grew older, those visits became my escape from the life my parents were carefully designing for me. At our house in Chicago, everything had expectations attached to it. Every grade, every event, every relationship. But in Vermont, there were no expectations. Just quiet mornings, warm tea, and conversations that stretched for hours. Grandpa had a habit of studying people when they spoke. His eyes would narrow slightly, as if he were looking beyond the words and into something deeper. One evening, when I was 17, we sat together by the fireplace while snow fell outside the window. "Olivia," he said thoughtfully, "do you know the difference between rich people and powerful people?" I shrugged. "Aren't they the same?" He smiled faintly. "Not always." He leaned back in his chair and stared into the fire. "Rich people chase money because they believe it will make them important," he continued. "Powerful people understand something different." "What?" I asked. "That money is only useful if it gives you the freedom to choose your own life." At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. In my parents' world, money was control. It was leverage. It was reputation. But to my grandfather, money seemed to mean something else entirely. Freedom. The last time I saw him was about 3 years ago. He had grown weaker by then. His hair had turned almost completely white, and the wrinkles around his eyes had deepened. But his mind remained sharp. That afternoon, the sky above Vermont was a soft gray, and the wind carried the scent of rain through the open windows. We sat together in his study. The room was filled with books stacked in uneven towers across the floor, old maps pinned to the walls, and framed photographs from decades past. He looked tired, but when he saw me, his eyes brightened like they always did. "Olivia," he said quietly, "come sit with me." I pulled a chair close to his desk and took his hand. It felt thinner than I remembered. For a while, we didn't speak. We just sat there, listening to the distant sound of wind moving through the trees outside. Then he squeezed my hand gently. "You're stronger than you think," he said. I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He studied my face carefully. "Your parents," he said slowly, "live in a world where everything has a price." I looked down. I didn't want to admit how true that was. "They'll try to shape you into something useful for them," he continued. "That's how they see the world." His voice softened. "But you don't belong to that world." I didn't know how to respond. For most of my life, I had assumed my future would eventually fall into the same patterns as theirs. The same business circles. The same social expectations. The same carefully arranged alliances. "Grandpa," I asked quietly, "what if I disappoint them?" He chuckled softly. "My dear girl," he said, "you already have." That surprised me. But before I could ask what he meant, he reached into the drawer of his desk. From inside, he pulled out a small black card. It looked simple. Matte black with a faint silver emblem in the center that resembled a crest. He placed it in my palm and gently closed my fingers around it. "If the world ever turns its back on you," he said softly, "go to Whitmore Trust Bank and use this." I turned the card over. There was no name, no numbers, nothing but that strange silver emblem. "What is it?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Insurance." "For what?" "For your freedom." I laughed nervously. "Grandpa, you're being mysterious again." But he didn't laugh. Instead, he looked at me with a seriousness that made the moment feel heavier than I understood. "Promise me something," he said. "What?" "That you'll only use it if you truly have no one left." I nodded. "I promise." At the time, I assumed it was just one of his eccentric gestures. A sentimental keepsake from an old man who loved riddles. A few weeks later, he passed away. The funeral was quiet. My parents attended out of obligation, not grief. My father spent most of the ceremony on his phone, and my mother whispered to a relative that the old Vermont house would probably be sold soon. I kept the card tucked inside my wallet, not because I believed it had any real value, but because it was the last thing my grandfather had given me. Now, years later, sitting alone on a cold park bench in downtown Chicago, I slowly reached into my wallet and pulled it out again. The small black card felt heavier than it should have. Under the dim glow of a street lamp, the silver emblem caught the light. Whitmore Trust Bank. My grandfather's voice echoed quietly in my memory. "If the world ever turns its back on you." I looked around the empty park. My parents had erased me from their lives just hours ago. I had no home, No plan. No one to call. And suddenly, for the first time, I realized something strange. Maybe my grandfather had known this moment would come. Maybe he had been preparing me for it all along. I closed my hand tightly around the card. Then I whispered quietly into the cold night air. "All right, Grandpa. Let's see what you left me." Whitmore Trust Bank stood in the center of Manhattan like a monument to old money. The building didn't scream wealth the way modern skyscrapers did. It didn't need glass towers or flashing logos. Its power came from something quieter, something older. Tall marble columns framed the entrance. Heavy bronze doors reflected the busy Manhattan street outside. Above them, carved into the stone facade, were the words, "Whitmore Trust Bank." The name made my chest tighten. Whitmore. My grandfather's name. I stood across the street for several minutes, staring at the building while taxis rushed past and people hurried along the sidewalks with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going. I didn't belong here. That thought repeated itself in my head over and over. My reflection in the glass window of a nearby cafe only confirmed it. My hair was messy from a sleepless night, my coat wrinkled, and the same clothes I had worn the day before still clung to me like evidence of how quickly my life had fallen apart. Everyone walking into that bank looked like they owned companies, buildings, or entire industries. I looked like someone who had slept on a park bench. For a moment, I considered leaving. Maybe my grandfather had only meant the card as a sentimental gesture. Maybe it wasn't even connected to this bank anymore. Maybe I would walk in, embarrass myself, and be politely escorted back outside. But then I remembered something he had said. If the world ever turns its back on you, well, the world had done exactly that. So I crossed the street. The moment I stepped through the bronze doors, the city noise disappeared behind me like a curtain closing. The interior of the bank was breathtaking. The ceiling stretched 3 stories high, painted with subtle golden patterns that reflected soft light across the room. Chandeliers hung above polished marble floors that looked so clean they almost resembled mirrors. People moved quietly inside, well-dressed clients speaking softly with advisors behind elegant wooden desks. Even the security guards looked calm, watchful, and professional. No one raised their voice. No one rushed. It felt less like a bank and more like a temple dedicated to wealth. I suddenly became very aware of how out of place I looked. But there was no turning back now. I walked slowly toward the reception desk near the center of the hall. The receptionist sat behind a sleek marble counter, typing something into her computer. She looked up as I approached. Her eyes briefly scanned my clothes. Her expression remained polite, but distant. "Good morning," she said professionally. "How may we assist you today?" My fingers tightened around the small black card in my hand. "I need to check an account," I said. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. She nodded slightly. "Of course. May I see your card?" I placed the black card on the counter. For a moment, she barely glanced at it. But then something caught her attention. Her eyes moved back to the card. Then she leaned slightly closer. The change in her expression was subtle, but noticeable. Without saying anything, she picked up the card carefully, almost cautiously, and stood from her chair. "One moment, please," she said quietly. She walked toward a glass office on the far side of the room. Inside sat a man in his early 50s wearing a dark suit and silver tie. His posture was straight, and the way he studied documents on his desk suggested someone used to making very important decisions. The receptionist knocked lightly before stepping inside. They exchanged a few quiet words. Then she handed him the card. The moment he saw it, his entire posture changed. Even from across the hall, I could see it. He froze. He looked down at the card, then at the receptionist, then back at the card again. Within seconds, he stood up abruptly and walked toward the front desk. His eyes locked on me, not with suspicion, with something closer to shock. "Miss?" he asked carefully. "Olivia," I replied. "Olivia Whitmore?" I hesitated. "Yes." He studied my face for a moment as if comparing it to something in his memory. Then he gestured politely toward a private office nearby. "Please come with me." The room he led me into was quiet and spacious, with tall windows overlooking Manhattan's skyline. A large wooden desk sat in the center, surrounded by leather chairs. "Please sit," he said. I sat slowly, still unsure what was happening. He closed the door behind us and returned to the desk, placing the black card carefully in front of him like it was something fragile. "My name is Daniel Hayes," he said. "I'm the senior manager of this branch." He slid the card into a small scanner attached to his computer. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then numbers began appearing on the screen. Daniel Hayes leaned forward slightly. At first his expression was neutral. Then his eyes widened. His eyebrows lifted. The color slowly drained from his face. He stared at the screen without blinking. Then he looked at me. Then back at the screen. Then at me again. His hands started shaking slightly as he adjusted his glasses. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly.
"Yes."
"Where did you get this card?" "My grandfather gave it to me." He swallowed. "Arthur Whitmore?"
"Yes."
For a moment, he said nothing. He simply stared at the screen again as if trying to confirm something that seemed impossible. "Do you have any idea what this account holds?" he asked carefully. I shook my head slowly.
"No."
The silence inside the office suddenly felt heavy. Daniel Hayes turned the monitor toward me. "Perhaps it would be easier if you saw it yourself." I leaned forward. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. The screen displayed an account summary filled with investment portfolios, international holdings, and several lines of financial data I didn't recognize. But my eyes were drawn to one number at the top of the screen. The total balance. My brain struggled to process it. The number looked wrong. Too large. Too absurd. I blinked and leaned closer. $1,204,000,000. $1,204,000,000. For a moment, I thought it had to be a mistake. This can't be right," I whispered. Daniel Hayes didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded slowly. "I assure you," he said carefully, "it is very real." The room suddenly felt smaller. The air felt heavier. My entire life had collapsed less than 24 hours ago. I had lost my home, my family, my future. And now I was staring at a screen telling me that somehow, impossibly, my grandfather had left me over $1 billion. I leaned back in the chair, my heart pounding.
"Why?"
I asked quietly. Daniel Hayes folded his hands together. "That," he said, "is a very long story." And judging by the way he looked at the screen again, it was a story that was about to change everything. The bank manager's name was Daniel Hayes, and he treated me with a mixture of respect and disbelief. Even after turning the monitor toward me and showing the impossible number on the screen, he continued studying my face carefully, as if trying to reconcile the young woman sitting in front of him with a massive fortune connected to my name. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I was still trying to breathe normally. $1 billion. The number echoed in my mind like a sound that refused to fade. My hands rested on the edge of the desk, but I could feel a faint tremor in my fingers. "Miss Whitmore," Daniel Hayes said gently, breaking the silence, "I understand this must be overwhelming." "That's one way to describe it," I said quietly. He gave a small, sympathetic smile. "You're not the first person to be surprised by your grandfather." I looked up at him. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering immediately, he turned the monitor back toward himself and pulled up several files. Charts appeared on the screen, financial structures, company names, investment branches across continents. The deeper he navigated through the system, the more complicated the network appeared. "This account," he said slowly, "is not simply a bank balance." He clicked another file. "It's the central holding account of an investment structure created nearly 40 years ago." I frowned. "An investment structure?" Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. Your grandfather, Arthur Whitmore, wasn't simply an investor, he said. He was the architect behind one of the most discreet financial networks in the world. I stared at him, unsure whether I had heard correctly. That's impossible, I said. My grandfather lived in a quiet house in Vermont. He read books and took walks in the woods. Daniel gave a faint smile. Yes, he said. That was the public version of Arthur Whitmore. He turned the monitor toward me again. The screen now displayed a list of corporations, technology firms, energy companies, global logistics networks, media conglomerates. Some of the names were instantly recognizable. Others were companies I had never heard of, but seemed massive judging by the financial numbers next to them. These corporations, Daniel explained, all share a silent investor. My stomach tightened. You're saying my grandfather owned them? Not directly, Daniel said, but he controlled the investment funds behind them. I leaned forward, trying to understand. For decades, he continued, Arthur Whitmore operated through a network of private funds and long-term investment trusts. His philosophy was very different from most wealthy investors.
How?
He believed visibility was dangerous. Daniel clicked another file. While other billionaires chased attention, influence, and public recognition, your grandfather preferred anonymity. He quietly invested in companies during their earliest stages, supported their growth, and then stepped back. The numbers on the screen made my head spin. It appears that over 40 years, those investments compounded into something very significant. That's an understatement, I murmured. Daniel chuckled softly. Yes, it is. For a moment, the room was quiet again. I looked down at the black card still resting on the desk. The same simple card my grandfather had handed me years ago, as if it were nothing special. Why didn't my parents know about this? I asked. Daniel's expression changed slightly. Because he didn't want them to. The words landed heavier than I expected. My grandfather hid all of this from his own family? Daniel nodded slowly. From what I understand, Mr. Whitmore had very strong concerns about how the next generation of the family viewed wealth. I let out a quiet breath. That sounds like them. Daniel folded his hands. Your grandfather believed money should create independence, he said, not control. The sentence sounded strangely familiar. Then I remembered. That was exactly what Grandpa had told me once by the fireplace in Vermont. Money gives you the freedom to choose your life. My chest tightened slightly. So he hid everything, I said.
Yes.
For decades.
Yes.
I sat back in my chair, trying to process the scale of what I was hearing. But if he had all this money, why live like that? Daniel shrugged gently. Some people become powerful because they want to dominate the world. He paused. Others become powerful so the world cannot dominate them. That sounded exactly like something my grandfather would say. I looked at the screen again. So why give all of this to me? Daniel opened another document. There was one final instruction attached to the account, he said. He turned the monitor toward me once more. At the bottom of the file was a legal clause. A condition. This account, Daniel explained, could only be activated if the beneficiary personally appeared at Whitmore Trust Bank with the original authorization card. I frowned slightly.
Why?
To confirm independence.
I blinked. I don't understand.
Daniel leaned forward. Your grandfather didn't want anyone else controlling this money, he said. If your parents had discovered the account while you were still dependent on them, they might have forced you to access it. But by requiring you to appear here personally, with a card, you had to reach this moment on your own. The realization hit me slowly. Like a wave rising from deep water. He had predicted this. My grandfather had known that one day I might stand alone. That one day my family might turn their backs on me. And he had built this entire system to protect me when that moment came.
My throat tightened.
So he knew, I whispered. Daniel didn't answer immediately, but the look in his eyes told me everything. Yes, he said quietly. He believed you would eventually need your freedom. The room felt strangely quiet. I looked down at my hands. All my life, my parents had treated me like a fragile extension of their plans. Something to be arranged. Something to be controlled. But somewhere, far away in that quiet Vermont house, my grandfather had been building something else entirely. Not for himself. For me. For the first time in my life, someone had believed in my future before the world had even broken me. My eyes stung slightly, but I forced myself to stay calm.
So what happens now? I asked.
Daniel Hayes smiled gently.
Now, Miss Whitmore.
He turned the monitor back toward himself and closed several documents. Now you decide what to do with one of the largest private investment portfolios in the country.
I stared at him.
My life had collapsed 2 days ago. Now the future in front of me felt bigger than anything I had ever imagined.
But strangely,
for the first time since leaving my parents' house, I didn't feel lost anymore. Because somewhere in the past, long before I understood what he was doing, my grandfather had already given me something my parents never had.
A choice.
News travels fast when money is involved. Especially in circles where influence, reputation, and wealth are treated like oxygen. For 2 days after my visit to Whitmore Trust Bank, I stayed in a quiet hotel near Central Park. Daniel Hayes had insisted the bank arrange temporary accommodations for me while the legal transfer of my grandfather's assets was finalized. The hotel room overlooked the city skyline, but I barely noticed the view. Most of my time was spent sitting by the window, trying to process the reality that my life had turned upside down in less than 72 hours. One day I was a daughter without a home. The next, I was the sole controller of an investment empire worth over $1 billion. But strangely, the money didn't feel real yet.
What felt real was the silence.
My phone had been quiet since the night my parents threw me out.
No calls. No messages. No concern.
That silence lasted exactly 48 hours. Then, suddenly, my phone rang. The name on the screen made my chest tighten.
Mother.
I stared at the phone for several seconds before answering.
Hello.
Her voice came through softer than I had ever heard it. Olivia, sweetheart. Sweetheart. The word felt unfamiliar coming from her.
Yes.
I replied cautiously. I've been worried about you, she said. The sentence was so unexpected that I almost laughed. Worried. 2 nights earlier, she had watched me walk out of the house without even asking where I would sleep. But now her voice carried warmth. Concern. Almost affection. We think it's time we talk, she continued gently. Your father and I want to make things right. I didn't answer immediately. My mother had always been a skilled negotiator. Her tone alone told me this conversation had already been carefully calculated.
Where?
I finally asked. We're in Manhattan, she said quickly. There's a restaurant your father likes near Fifth Avenue. Of course there was. Luxury restaurants had always been his preferred meeting place for important discussions. Tomorrow evening, she added.
I paused. Part of me wanted to refuse.
But another part of me was curious.
Curious to see how quickly people could change when money entered the equation.
All right, I said. The restaurant my parents chose was exactly what I expected.
Elegant. Exclusive.
And expensive enough that most people would need a month's salary to pay for dinner. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Soft piano music filled the room. Waiters moved silently between tables carrying plates that looked more like art than food. My parents were already seated when I arrived. My father stood up the moment he saw me. Something he had never done before. Olivia, he said warmly. He even pulled out a chair for me. The gesture alone told me everything I needed to know.
They knew. Or at least they suspected.
My mother smiled gently as I sat down. You look tired, she said softly. I studied their faces carefully. 2 days ago, they had treated me like a problem that needed to be removed. Now they looked at me like someone extremely valuable had just walked into the room. "Let's skip the performance," I said calmly. The smile on my mother's face stiffened slightly. "I'm not sure what you mean," she replied. My father leaned forward with a patient expression. "Olivia," he said, "we're your parents. We're simply trying to repair a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. I almost admired the elegance of the lie. "You mean the part where you kicked me out of the house?" I asked. My father cleared his throat. "That situation was emotional." "No," I said quietly. It was very clear. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then my mother reached across the table and gently touched my hand. Another gesture she had rarely made before. "We regret how things happened," she said softly. "We were under a lot of pressure." Pressure. The word hung in the air. Then my father leaned forward slightly. His voice lowered. "Olivia," he said, "we've recently learned something interesting." There it was. The truth. "Have you?" I replied. He studied my face carefully. "You visited Whitmore Trust Bank," he said. It wasn't a question. So they definitely knew. I didn't deny it. "Yes." My father smiled. But it wasn't the proud smile of a parent. It was the satisfied smile of a businessman who had just confirmed an investment opportunity. "Your grandfather always had unusual ways of managing his finances," he said. That was a very polite way of describing a billion-dollar secret. My mother's voice softened again. "You must have been shocked," she said. I was. My father leaned closer. "Which is why we should discuss how to handle it responsibly." I tilted my head slightly. "Responsibly?" "Yes," he said. "This kind of wealth requires experience, connections, strategic planning. In other words, control." He folded his hands on the table and smiled. "Olivia, we should rebuild our family." The sentence sounded rehearsed, perfectly polished. But his eyes betrayed him. They weren't warm. They weren't emotional. They were calculating. He wasn't looking at his daughter. He was looking at $1.2 billion. My mother nodded encouragingly. "We can guide you," she said. "Help you manage everything." There it was again. Help, guide, manage. Words that really meant the same thing. Take control. I suddenly remembered the night my grandfather gave me the black card. Money should give you the freedom to choose your own life. For most of my life, I had allowed my parents to make every decision for me. What school I attended, who I spent time with, what future I was supposed to build. But now, for the first time, the power dynamic between us had changed. My father waited patiently for my answer. The restaurant around us buzzed with quiet conversation, but at our table everything felt still. Then I smiled. A calm, polite smile. "Thank you," I said. Both of my parents relaxed slightly. They thought they had won. But then I finished the sentence. "But no." The word landed like a stone dropping into water. My father blinked. "I'm sorry." I said no. The polite smile remained on my face. "But I appreciate the offer." For the first time that evening, the warmth disappeared from my parents' expressions. My mother's hand slowly pulled away from mine. "Olivia," my father said carefully, "I don't think you understand the complexity of this situation." "Oh, I understand it perfectly," I replied. I stood up from the table. "You didn't come here for me." I looked directly into his eyes. "You came for the money." The silence between us suddenly felt enormous. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small sitting across from them. Because the girl they had tried to control was gone. And the woman standing in her place had finally learned something my grandfather had understood all along. Some doors, once closed, should never be reopened. Having $1 billion didn't bring happiness. If anything, it brought clarity. For most of my life, I had believed money was something distant, something powerful people fought over in boardrooms and business deals far removed from ordinary emotions. But now that it sat quietly in an account attached to my name, I realized something unsettling. Money didn't change the world. It revealed it. Within days of my meeting with my parents, my phone began ringing constantly. Numbers I didn't recognize. Emails from people I had never met. Messages from acquaintances I barely remembered. People who had been silent for years suddenly remembered I existed.
Olivia, it's been so long.
I just heard the incredible news. We should catch up sometime. The tone was always friendly, but underneath the friendliness was something else. Opportunity. One afternoon, while sitting in my hotel room, I received a message from a former college classmate named Amanda. We had studied business together during my second year at Northwestern, but after graduation we had drifted apart. Now she wanted to meet for lunch. Curious, I agreed. We met at a small cafe in Soho. Amanda arrived 20 minutes early and greeted me with an enthusiastic hug. "Olivia, you look amazing," she said. I smiled politely.
"So do you."
For a few minutes we talked about harmless things, her job in marketing, mutual friends, the strange pace of New York life. But eventually, the conversation drifted exactly where I expected it to go.
"So," Amanda said casually, stirring her coffee, "I heard you inherited quite a portfolio."
Portfolio. That was a very polite way to describe it.
"Yes," I said. "That must be incredible," she continued. "I mean, having that kind of opportunity." Opportunity. Another interesting word. She leaned forward slightly.
"My company has been looking for investors for a new project," she said.
And there it was. The real reason for lunch.
I listened politely while she explained her company's idea, a marketing technology startup trying to expand into international markets. The proposal itself wasn't bad, but I couldn't ignore the quiet shift in her tone. She wasn't talking to Olivia anymore. She was talking to a potential funding source. I nodded thoughtfully. "I'll have my team look at it," I said.
Her eyes brightened. "You have a team?"
Apparently. That was another strange part of my new life. Daniel Hayes had introduced me to several financial advisors who had previously worked closely with my grandfather's investment network. They helped me understand the complicated structure of the portfolio he had built.
It was enormous.
Companies across technology, renewable energy, logistics, media, and international finance.
Some investments were decades old.
Others were quietly growing startups that my grandfather had supported long before anyone else believed in them. But even with their help, the responsibility felt heavy. Every decision affected thousands of employees, entire industries,
markets in countries I had never even visited.
And every time I signed a document approving an investment move, I felt the invisible weight of my grandfather's legacy pressing quietly against my shoulders.
Power. Real power. The kind my parents had always chased. But power had a strange side effect. It created distance.
Within weeks, my social world changed dramatically. Invitations arrived almost daily.
Private dinners. Investment conferences. Networking events. People smiled more. Listened more carefully when I spoke.
And yet, something about those interactions always felt slightly hollow.
They weren't seeing me.
They were seeing the number attached to my name. One evening, after attending a particularly exhausting investment dinner, I walked alone through Central Park. The city lights glowed softly through the trees, and the cool evening air carried the distant sound of traffic. For the first time all day, there were no phones ringing, no advisors calling, no investors pitching ideas. Just quiet. I found myself walking toward a familiar bench near the edge of the park. The same place where I had sat only weeks earlier with my suitcase beside me, wondering how my life had collapsed so completely. Back then, I had felt powerless, abandoned, broken. Now the situation had reversed completely. I had more financial power than most people could imagine. But sitting on that same bench again, I realized something surprising. The loneliness hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had simply changed shape. Wealth had opened doors that were previously closed to me, but it had also quietly erased the illusion of genuine relationships. My parents wanted control. Old acquaintances wanted investment. Business executives wanted access. Everyone wanted something, except the one person who had given me everything. My grandfather. I leaned back slightly and looked up at the dark sky above the park. For a moment, I imagined him sitting beside me like he used to on the porch in Vermont. Calm. Thoughtful. Watching the world with quiet understanding. You left me a lot to figure out, I murmured softly. The wind rustled the leaves overhead. In that quiet moment, I finally understood something he had been trying to teach me for years. Money was not the goal. It was the tool. A tool that could create freedom, or control, compassion, or greed, opportunity, or destruction. The difference wasn't the money itself. It was the person holding it. I looked down at my hands. For the first time since inheriting my grandfather's fortune, I felt something that wasn't confusion or pressure. I felt purpose beginning to form. The money could build companies. It could influence industries. It could change lives. But it couldn't erase the past. It couldn't buy back a childhood that had never truly existed. And it couldn't replace the one person who had believed in me long before the world knew my name. But maybe, just maybe, it could help me build a future that looked nothing like the one my parents had tried to force on me. And for the first time since this strange new life began, that possibility felt stronger than the loneliness. Months later, I stood outside the same park where everything had started. The air was warmer now. Spring had slowly replaced the bitter cold that had once wrapped itself around the city the night I lost everything. Trees that had been bare and skeletal during that lonely evening were now covered in fresh green leaves, moving gently in the breeze. Life had returned to the park. And strangely enough, so had I. But this time, I wasn't alone. Behind me stood a modest but beautifully renovated building with tall windows and a welcoming entrance. Above the doorway hung a simple bronze plaque that reflected the soft glow of the evening sun. The Whitmore Foundation. The letters felt both surreal and deeply personal every time I looked at them. Just a few months earlier, I had been sitting on a cold park bench with nothing but a suitcase and a fading phone battery. I had believed my life was finished before it had even properly begun. Now, people were walking through those doors behind me with hope in their eyes. Young people. Students. Dreamers. Outcasts. People like me. The Whitmore Foundation had officially opened its first program that morning. The mission was simple but powerful: to help young adults who had been abandoned, rejected, or pushed aside by their families rebuild their lives with dignity. Housing. Education support. Career mentorship. Financial guidance. Not charity. Opportunity. That was the word I had insisted on using when we first designed the program. Opportunity. Because the moment someone receives an opportunity, their story is no longer defined by what they lost. It's defined by what they can become. Inside the building, I could hear the low hum of voices. Volunteers were helping participants settle into their new living spaces on the upper floors, while advisors were preparing orientation sessions for the following week. Earlier that afternoon, I had walked through the building and met the first group of residents. There was Marcus, a quiet 19-year-old who had been sleeping in subway stations after his foster placement ended. There was Elena, a nursing student whose parents had cut off all contact when she refused to abandon her career ambitions. There was Jordan, who had spent years bouncing between relatives after his father disappeared and his mother struggled with addiction. Each story was different, but the pain underneath them was familiar. The feeling of being discarded, forgotten, unwanted. Standing there now, I could still remember the exact moment this idea had first formed. It happened on that same park bench where I had once sat alone. The night when the loneliness had felt heavier than the entire city around me. That was when I realized something my grandfather must have understood long before I did. Money alone meant nothing, but what you chose to do with it could change everything. The foundation had started as a quiet idea during a late-night conversation with Daniel Hayes and a small group of advisors. Instead of expanding the investment empire my grandfather had built, I wanted part of that wealth to do something different. Something personal. Something human. Daniel had listened carefully before nodding. "I believe your grandfather would approve," he had said. And somehow, I knew he was right. A voice behind me pulled me back into the present. "Miss Whitmore?" I turned around. It was Marcus. He stood a few feet away, shifting nervously as if unsure whether he should approach. "Hi," I said warmly. He hesitated before speaking. "I just wanted to say, thank you." His voice was quiet but sincere. "For what?" I asked gently. "For this place," he said, gesturing toward the building. "I didn't think anyone would ever give someone like me a chance." Something inside my chest tightened slightly. I remembered thinking those exact same words not so long ago. "Everyone deserves a chance," I replied softly. He nodded. Then he walked back inside. I watched the door close behind him before turning back toward the park. The bench was still there, exactly where it had always been. The same bench where my life had collapsed. And strangely, I felt grateful for it now. Because if my parents had never kicked me out, if I had never spent that lonely night questioning everything, I might never have understood the kind of life I truly wanted to build. My phone vibrated quietly in my coat pocket. I glanced at the screen. Another message from my father. He had been trying to contact me again recently. Calls, emails, even letters. None of them mentioned the foundation. None of them mentioned how proud they were. They only talked about family reconciliation. I slipped the phone back into my pocket without replying. Some bridges don't need to be rebuilt. And for the first time in my life, that realization didn't hurt anymore. The sun was beginning to set now, casting long golden reflections across the tall buildings of Manhattan. The skyline shimmered in the distance like a city full of endless possibilities. I took a slow breath and looked up at the glowing horizon. For years, my parents had tried to design my life for me. They had mapped out the perfect marriage, the perfect alliances, the perfect future that served their ambitions. But the moment they pushed me out of their world, they unknowingly gave me something far greater. Freedom. Not the kind of freedom that comes from money, but the kind that comes from choosing your own path. I had inherited more than my grandfather's fortune. I had inherited his quiet rebellion, the courage to walk away from expectations, the courage to build something better than the world that tried to break me. And as the evening light slowly faded across the city, I finally understood something that healed the deepest wound in my heart. My parents may have kicked me out of their house, but my grandfather had given me something far more powerful. A future. A future defined not by control, but by compassion. A future shaped not by fear, but by choice. And most importantly, a future that no one would ever take away from me again.